Hello, this is Elaine with the BERYL Consulting Group. Today we're joined by Sassan Ghahramani, the founder and CEO of SGH Macro Advisors, where he advises some of the world's leading hedge funds, asset managers, and policymakers on global macro developments. With over a decade of experience as a senior foreign exchange trader on Wall Street and deep expertise in central banks and geopolitics, his work focuses on translating policy decisions into market implications across rates, equity, and currencies. Welcome, Sassan. Great to have you today.
Thank you, Elaine, for having me on.
So to start broadly, over the past few days, we've seen a pretty complex picture unfold. The ceasefire is technically in place, but at the same time, we're also seeing a US blockade being implemented, continued tensions around the Strait of Hormuz, and even discussions about a potential second round of talks. So despite all of that uncertainty, let's start with the ceasefire itself. What evidence suggests that the 2-week ceasefire between the United States and Iran is likely to hold despite ongoing tension?
We wrote a piece last Wednesday, so almost a week and a half ago, saying specifically that the ceasefire was going to hold. The main reason is that both sides want to get to a deal. You have to kind of cut through a lot of the noise and see where we are in this process. So I'll start with maybe just a little image of a cartoon that I saw 2 or 3 weeks ago, which I thought was very funny. It was Trump lying on a couch of a therapist, as a cartoonist can draw, his hands on his belly, and the therapist was saying, "So, Mr. Trump, these Iranians who keep calling you, do you see them in the room right now?" And I thought that was really funny
Mm,
cartoon, and I thought about sending that around to my team, but I
mm,
didn't because there were communications from Iran at the time. And this was really the big turning point. And what was critical for us was 2 weekends ago when the former foreign minister of Iran, Javad Zarif, wrote an op-ed in Foreign Affairs magazine, kind of a hardline position, but really opening up ground for talk. Former foreign minister, traditionally known as a moderate. And the intel that we got, specifically from the Chinese side, who have been in close contact with the current Iranian foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, and the entire Iranian government, was that this op-ed was not just condoned by the young Khamenei and Ghalibaf, who's really the person running Iran right now, the head of the parliament, but that they had asked him to write this. And we got this and we said, okay, this is critical. This is an important turning point. It was telegraphed for a while that Trump wanted to de-escalate. And so this was a signal from the Iranian side that enough is enough. We're ready to come to the table.
One of the more interesting dynamics behind this seems to be the role of external players. Did China influence Iran's decision to move towards a ceasefire and the potential negotiations with the United States?
As markets have been sniffing around for a while, China, has sort of conflicting strands with the conflict in Iran. On the economic front, 90% of Iran's oil is destined, for the Pacific and for China. China gets oil from many different suppliers, but Iran and the rest of the Gulf is clearly one of its largest suppliers of oil. They have plenty of oil in storage and so on, but it certainly is not good for them to have this kind of spike. And in particular, people look at the futures markets and, now oil has dropped a lot with the news that these negotiations are going on. But even when Brent futures were like at 100, 110, the actual oil for delivery cargoes were trading at 140. So this was a big, big price spike. So of course, China, it's not in their interest to have these prices sustained for a long time and this kind of shutdown. On the other hand, having the U.S. bogged down in the Middle East is strategically not the worst thing for China. If you take a step back, everything that we get from China and as far as the Sino-U.S. relationships, and this plays into the May 14th, 15th summit between President Xi Jinping and President Trump, is that both sides are really looking to enhance stability of relationships between the two. Neither side wants to escalate. And maybe you don't get a huge breakthrough either, but let's keep things going basically as is. So there was a sort of a soft deadline, I suppose, ahead of this summit, which is still on. Not only is it on, but Beijing is making preparation. They're upset about the naval blockade, but at the same time, we wrote a report yesterday that says that they're looking to roll out the red carpet for Trump and Melania, the first lady, when she comes there, and they're going to take them to the Temple of Heaven and do all this pomp and circumstance and military parades and all this kind of stuff. And so, yes, they clearly they have a lot of influence on Iran. Of course, when you're in an existential fight like the Iranian leadership, you have other considerations as well, survival. But once the environment, especially on the U.S. side, looked like there may be some softening of the position from President Trump that he's looking to de-escalate, then the Chinese were quite happy to facilitate. And not only that, they've gone public in their efforts and said, we helped bring these negotiations to where they are now.
It feels like investors are looking beyond just the headlines and trying to interpret the underlying intent from both sides. So in that context, markets seems to be pricing in the idea that despite a breakdown in talks, both sides still want a negotiated outcome. How do you interpret that dynamic?
I think that's completely correct interpretation, as you can guess from my answer to your first question. I was on CNBC on Monday morning because it was after the round of talks and they wanted to see how the talks progressed. And my basic message, and it was like 5:30 in the morning. So it was before all the markets open and all that. But I said these negotiations are going to continue. There's no breakdown here. You got to take a step back, look at the big picture. People look at Iran's 10 or 15 demands and the US's 10 demands. And there were all these things in the press that said, oh, if you try to do Venn diagrams, there's no, overlap between this. And I'm like, that's silly in this world. You have two sides who are staking out extreme positions, and that there are actually areas of overlap. It's not going to be easy. We know it's not going to be easy. It's going to be back and forth, but the big picture, and for the markets, what matters is that you've had peak escalation. That means that even if there's a breakdown and the US decides to strike again to soften up Iran's position, which could happen, and markets will certainly not like that. But I think we're going to get lower lows and higher highs. I think people will look through that.
On that, there's always a question of whether markets are interpreting these signals correctly. What do you think markets are getting right, or maybe potentially misreading at this stage?
I think markets by and large are getting this right. I would not argue with this move in the risk assets. On the energy markets, I mean, look, oil has come down a lot over these last couple of days. I think we're in the 80s right now, in the mid 80s on both Brent and West Texas. I think that the thing that we should be sensitive to is the extent of the damage that's done to the infrastructure. The taking out of LNG capacity at the Ras Laffan terminal in Qatar is quite substantial. There's been some damage done to Kuwait oil fields. So I look at it as sort of two things. One is reestablishment of, specifically to the Strait, the U.S. blockade. That's not happened yet. It's only, a small trickle, but markets are looking through that and assuming that we're on the resolution path. I think that's a correct interpretation. The other is the issue of capacity and how that's going to affect different economies. Now, I do think that markets are right in the conclusion that the U.S. is much more insulated from high energy prices than Europe and Asia in particular. So I think the markets have got that right. But maybe as far as how the backwardation of the curve and how steeply we might fall, I think maybe that might be a little trickier. Maybe this has a little bit more impact than what we've had, the high energy prices on earnings and things like that. Although the duration has not been this long, but the duration of high prices could stay for a little while. But generally speaking, I think that's fine tuning, to be honest. I think overall, I've been on board this market move. I'm not certainly not fighting it. And now we all watch the US side and people, it's covered very heavily. But in the interest rate markets, what's happened also is that markets have priced out a lot of rate hikes that they expected from, two of the economies that were most vulnerable, the UK, the Bank of England, and the European Central of this. We were pricing, 85 basis points of hikes out of the ECB, and now it's down to 40. And we might not get any. And I think that would be, kind of interesting. But again, the directionality I agree with. And even if we get another spike in energy prices, I think markets are looking as that we are in some sort of resolution phase. The internal situation in Iran could be very dicey for a long time. There's a lot of stress that is going to be imposed on Iran as a country, given all the damage. And so that political story could maybe even accelerate, who knows, pressure on the regime. But what we have been telling our clients from the very start is that it's important to distinguish between two things. One is the political story inside Iran story, and the second is for financial markets. It comes down to energy markets and security of flows and infrastructure. There's been some damage done. It's not the end of the world. It'll take some while to repair, but you can also be guaranteed that the Trump administration is going to do everything it can as we approach the midterm elections to push energy prices down through the summer for U.S. consumers, gasoline prices, and all that. There's already been, they're putting pressure on U.S. oil producers. That might be tricky because, they would produce a lot if they thought that, that oil would be at 90 or 100, but these are long-term decisions. The more likely lever to me is actually that the U.S. coordinates this with the Gulf allies who are very on board with working with the U.S. And Trump in particular, especially the Emirates and Saudi, after having been, attacked belligerently and aggressively by Iran. So maybe we get that to push oil prices down. Let's call it over the summer, which is going to be very important politically.
Great. And finally, looking ahead over the next couple of weeks, what are the key signals or developments you'll be watching to assess whether the situation stabilizes or escalates further?
Trump has narrowed down the negotiating points from many to I was going to say this been all over the place and all of that. So one of the things that they dropped is regime change, right? And they're saying that, oh, this is regime change, but that's silly. That's the same regime, just different people, right? But the U.S. isn't going to push for that. So that objective is gone. The other ones are military objectives, missile capability, Air Force, Navy. The U.S. can say we've achieved all of those. And I think, not 100%, but enough. And so the things that we're negotiating over now are nuclear and the straits, right? And nuclear has two components. The first component, and this is super important domestically in the US, because people otherwise say, well, why did you bother going to get that 440 kilos of enriched uranium that Iran has still. They've said that they have it, and to get an agreement on that. And the others, of course, assurances on future nuclear development. The Iranians, I firmly think, are very bribable. They will take money or some sort of promises. They'll negotiate it, but on turning over the uranium, turn it over to Russia or France. Maybe people aren't talking about that, but there's been a lot of back channels between Macron and Pezeshkian and Ghalibaf in Iran. So I think that's not as hard. The Iranians say, oh, our goal was never to get nuclear weapons anyways. Obviously, people don't believe them, so they could say that again. There's got to be a little bit more than that to satisfy the administration. And on the Straits, I thought the decision by the Trump administration, it's almost like jujitsu, or you're using the force and you're flipping it back on them to move the blockade, to actually say, okay, well, Iran is blockading the Strait. So, okay, we're not going to have direct military and be in the line of fire, but we're going to do our blockade out here, and you're not going to be able to sell your oil either. I thought it was brilliant, actually. And that's a big turning point. The Iranians never expected that because they assumed that, oh, this is going to drive the price of oil higher and Trump isn't going to do it because, he doesn't want to risk, oil going higher. And they did it. It was, I think, a bold move. And I think the markets look through the fact that, that there's been virtually no oil cargo ships. There have been other ships that have gone through, and they're just looking and saying, okay, well, this has brought them to the table, and now we are ready to go. So two things I look for, simply the nuclear and the Straits. Those are really the two main issues here. And I do think that there's room for resolution. I think the markets look through that.
The key takeaway is that both sides still appear aligned towards avoiding escalation. Markets will continue to focus on policy signals, especially around energy in the Strait of Hormuz, as we watched how this evolves over the coming weeks. Thank you again, Sassan, for sharing your perspectives with us today. And thank you to everyone for tuning in to BERYL Elites.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the conversation.